Welcome to Western Sydney Community Forum's interactive live stream. My name is Anita Hanna and I'm your host for today's session. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the many lands on which we're meeting today for this session. I'm personally on lands of the Cabrogal clan of the Darug Nation, a beautiful country. And I pay my respects to elders on this land and beyond, past, present, and future. I would also like to acknowledge with respect Aboriginal friends and colleagues who are joining us today. So thank you for joining us today. Today is one of our interactive live stream forums, which are a series of sessions that bring together community organisations and stakeholders across Western Sydney during COVID-19 to provide information on regional priorities. Today's session is about how organisations can support communities to bounce back after COVID, and will focus on resilience and recovery. There's an opportunity for you as an attendee to contribute to the conversation and ask questions. You can contribute at any time by clicking the raise hand button on your device and you will join a queue. We will then enable you to share your question through your voice facility. If you prefer, you can click on the Q&A button and type your question, which I will then read out on your behalf. We will do our best to respond to all questions. Note that if you are joining on the live stream, you can also post comments and questions on the stream, and they will be shared in this forum. So I'd now like to introduce our panelists. I'd like to introduce Ken Zulumovski, who's the Managing Director of Gamarada Universal Indigenous Resources. Welcome, Ken. I'd like to introduce Alison Morgan, who's the Director, Greater Sydney Recovery and Portfolio Projects at Resilience New South Wales. Welcome, Alison. And I'd lastly like to introduce Professor Jim Ife, who is the Professor of Social Work at Western Sydney University. Welcome, Jim. So we'll go straight into the questions. My first question is for all three panelists, and we might start with Ken. Ken, community organisations are now at the stage of thinking about supporting communities in the recovery process. What are some of the key social issues that need to be considered in recovery in Western Sydney? Just unmute, Ken.
Hi, Anita, and hello to all the listeners. Thanks for joining us. Key considerations in recovery from COVID-19. Like broadly speaking, or from an Indigenous perspective, Anita?
Both, I think, Ken.
Yeah, well, look, from a First Nations perspective, and I don't speak for all First Nations people when I say this, but you know, some of the key considerations for us are really include kind of continuing to do business as we do business, and just being mindful that you know, our communities are constantly in a state of you know, advocacy and recovery and progress and innovation as well. So, you know, times like this, we do need to work harder, and you know, of course, we look to our strengths. So we look at our cultures, which is the obvious answer. What strengths lie in that? And then we look at our kinship systems, who around us can support us. Our close family, our extended family, our communities, our our peak organisations. We're very busy working in this space to provide, policy direction and guidance. We look at our healing practices and our programs and our resources to help us deal with the outcomes of extra stresses. We've heard that families have been struggling in this situation. We've heard that there's been an increase in alcohol consumption more broadly in the general community. I haven't seen any research of that happening in our community specifically, but it may be happening. We need to keep a watch on it. We need to, I think, get on the ground and as much as we can and organise. Organise ourselves. We can't wait for government or for community services to reach us. We have to be very proactive, and we have to lead. We have to take initiative. And our communities are pretty good at doing that because we've had a lot of practice.
Thanks, Ken. Definitely some words of wisdom and ways that we can support. Western Sydney's home to one of the largest urban Aboriginal populations in Australia. So definitely thank you for sharing those insights with the community sector and our organisations. Alison, what would you think are some of the key social considerations to be considered for recovery in Western Sydney?
Thank you, Anita, and hello to everybody. I think for me, we've taken in Resilience New South Wales to talking about normal disasters as opposed to other disasters, which is a pretty sad way of thinking about the world. But for many of us who've been involved in recovery, and particularly disaster recovery, quite a long time, this COVID pandemic has a number of characteristics that I think are really different. And I think this will be important for your member organisations in how they think about how they support their clients and their community. But overwhelmingly, of course, this has been an economic issue for us. It's a health-generated problem, but we have so far, fingers and toes crossed, been able to manage the health implications reasonably well in this country. And so I think for most of us, the impacts now are around economics. And so one fundamental difference for us is that this affects every single person in Australia. And most disasters and recovery processes don't impact on every single person. So I think that's a really fundamental thing for our groups to think about. So, sorry, I don't know if you could see that. That's one element for me. The other thing is this disaster, as opposed to others, I think has really shattered people's sense of security. And so there's a sense about however your life was organised and whatever your normal was, what we're going to return to is probably more like a new normal. And so some of the considerations for us, what the new normal looks like will be very different from one group in the community to another. And certainly your members are going to be, much better connected and understand what a new normal might look like. And that has real sorts of possibilities for us as well. This isn't just from a sort of deficit and a negative perspective. Some of this is going to open up, I think, some really fantastic opportunities and potential thinking, new thinking around a number of aspects of our lives. So I think for me, there are two characteristics around this particular event where we're thinking about recovery that are quite different to what we've done before.
Thanks so much, Alison. I think there's definitely food for thought there. And yeah, I didn't think of it in that way before about it. It does impact every single person, all the different population groups, everyone in our community and our country. Jim, I'd like to turn to you and just get your thoughts on what do you think are the key social issues that we need to focus on?
Thanks, Anita, and hello, everybody. And I'd just like also to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and the Darug people who are the traditional owners of where I happen to be at the moment, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Look, in many ways the issues are the same as they've always been, but COVID-19 has sharpened a lot of those issues for us. It's brought them to the fore. It's made them more real and immediate for people, but the issues are the same. There are issues of job insecurity, which is worse. There are issues of poverty, of racism, of violence, mental health issues, and so on. So I think we need to remember that the issues that we've been working with for a long time are still there, but they've been foregrounded. I think I'd want to put a slightly different focus, however, on the idea of the new normal, because I don't think there is a new normal yet. I think if we say a new normal, we're assuming that we'll reach fairly quickly more or less a status quo, something where we know how things work, we know the rules and so on. I don't think we're going to get to that new normal anytime soon, because I think the kind of society we live in has so many instabilities built into it, economic, ecological, social, and so on, that I don't think we can assume we're just going to get out of this into something called a new normal. I think continuing change and crisis is going to be the experience that we're all going to have for a number of years yet. So to me, it's very much about how do we cope with an insecurity and with an acceptance that there probably isn't a new normal, and even if there is, none of us knows what it is anyway. So it's coping with that insecurity that I think becomes so important.
Absolutely. And Jim, I'll just go straight into the next question, which is for you,
Okay.
And you've alluded to this a little bit, but what do you think we should be recovering to?
Well, I think even though I said that the issues are the same, we shouldn't be recovering to the same. And we should try and not be thinking in terms of how can we get back to what we had. Because we're not, the world is going to change because of COVID. COVID has brought to the fore the kinds of crises that we all knew were going to happen anyway, economic crises, ecological crises, and so on. So I really think it's important that we think in terms of those sort of possibilities. And just to reiterate the point that's already been made, in terms of people's responses to disasters, there's one response that says, how can we rebuild what we had? But there's another response that says, how can we actually start again, make things better? So I think we do have to be thinking the second way. As Alison said, I completely agree with her on this, that we have to be imaginative, we have to be working with communities around envisaging a better future that isn't just a return to the same old normal. Most people were pretty dissatisfied with the same old normal, really. So the opportunity that's there, I think, for the reimagining and the revisioning is really important. But as to what we should be recovering to, I don't think any of us can really answer that, because I think that has to be done at a community level. I think communities have to be taking that on. And we need to be helping communities to ask those questions of themselves and come up with their own answers about what their community is going to look like post-COVID.
Thanks, Jim. And I think probably all the audience members that are here today think the same way. And, you know, we're all committed to working with communities, and we are the community in a sense, to work with them to help develop and realise their vision for the future and what an equitable world would mean to them. I'll go to the next question, which is for Alison. Alison, what are some examples of effective recovery processes that you have seen, and what made them effective? I know you did mention that this was a little different to the other processes that you've seen, in that it impacts everybody. But if there are examples that you're able to share of effective recovery processes, we would be really interested in hearing about them and finding out what made them effective.
Thanks, Anita. Look, I think there definitely are, we were just alluding to them just now, but there's a number of things that fundamentally I think do make for good recovery, community-led recovery. And there's no doubt about it that is the only sort of, all the international research shows us that community-led recovery is really the only way that you're going to get any kind of long-term or sustainable recovery for people. And that fundamentally doesn't matter whether you're talking about a flood that has impacted 5 houses, as opposed to our recent experience of the bushfires where we've had thousands of people directly and indirectly impacted, or something like COVID-19 where every single person has been impacted. But some of the fundamentals about good recovery are the same. And the most important one is that it's communities that lead recovery. The recovery process comes from the community. It doesn't matter what government or anybody else does around them. All we really can do is support communities to recover. So I think that's a really important understanding. The other thing I think which helps us think about this is that no two people recover the same way, and everybody recovers at a different pace. So really good recovery processes and supports have to be quite flexible, and they have to be tailored to meet the needs of either individuals or groups of people. And I think that's one element where your members particularly have a really key role to play, is that you are connected in with groups in our community, many of whom have a particular need or are suffering from some kind of disadvantage, or there's a reason why people have come together in a group to work with your members. And so that knowledge of people and knowledge of their circumstances allows for the tailoring of recovery processes. So I guess one of the examples, you've asked me to sort of give an example. I'm going to pick a quite small one, and it's a very simple one, but I think it illustrates this. It comes from the current bushfire recovery, and it comes from a little community up called Running Stream in the hills behind Mudgee. Beautiful place. And so we, the government, we've come in to do all sorts of stuff around bushfire recovery, far more significant government engagement in a disaster recovery than we've had ever before. But this little community have really said to us, when you come to talk to us, we don't want recovery centres, we don't want you to set up a hall, we don't want to do this, we don't want to do that. All the sort of traditional things we do in a place when there's been a natural disaster. What they've said is, as a community, the place we get together is in the shop. There's one small shop in the little village. It doubles as a coffee shop. It also has the post office outlet. It's the hub of the community. And so they have had one of the most effective recovery hubs operating across all of Australia under this bushfire recovery, because they've really tailored it to meet what it is that the community wants and how the community likes to work and how the community operates. So it's been a very informal drop-in. We will have people here from government agencies and support networks on Tuesdays from 10 till 12 and on Thursdays from 3 till 4. And anyone who wants to come and call in. It's very much relied on other people in the community to make sure that their neighbours know about it. There's no pressure on people to have to attend. It's provided a safe environment where people can come. We hear from the community about the needs they have. What information do they need? Do they need to sign up for grants? Do they need information about rebuilding? What is it they need? And we've brought that support to them. So I think for me, while it's been a small illustration, it really shows the need to understand the community, to tailor recovery to a way that works for that community, and the community need to own it. Governments will come and go. Government agencies will breeze in and breeze out of places when there's a disaster. Community stays, and that's the difference. So we really need to focus on how we can best understand those community networks, how we can tailor recovery processes and systems to let people recover at their own pace and in a way that works for that community, that person in that place.
Thanks so much, Alison. Absolutely, it's critical. And I can see some of the comments coming in from the audience. So after we ask Ken this next question, we might turn to some of the audience members' comments and questions. Because they're absolutely, what you're saying is spot on, and people are definitely agreeing with that. But Ken, you've done a lot of work promoting well-being and building resilience, primarily with Aboriginal community members. What are some of the considerations in supporting resilience at both an individual level and at a community level?
Hi, Anita. Thanks for that question. And thanks, was it Jane from the audience? It was Jane. Look, it's a really good question. Our mobs have demonstrated leadership. It's kind of exciting time, I think, for our communities, because this whole leadership space, we've had to develop leaders in order to survive, and leadership in various important spaces that relate to this current predicament. Areas like social and emotional well-being, areas like mental health, violence. Even in the leadership space itself, we've had to evolve and develop. If you think about what Indigenous First Nations people have had to endure over the last 4 or 5 generations or 100 years, we've learned to to organise ourselves. You only have to look at the calibre of our peak organisations and the policy and the directives and the conferences that you can go to. The Deutsche Institute for Research, the conference last year in Darwin, there's 750 people. The conference statement was like, one of the most empowering statements that you could read that's come out of any First Nations response to colonisation and empowering themselves. Our mobs are really, really organised. On the ground in community, sometimes, we're fractured, sometimes we're still suffering those direct effects of colonisation. Mental health is a massive part of it. And then the substance abuse and the symptomatic, problems that come from family dislocation and, social fabric of communities being torn apart. But the leadership space is, this particular time is very, very exciting and opportunistic. I think First Nations have an incredible amount to share in the space to the nation, to the broader communities. If we look back at some of the recent documents that we've put together in this space where we are rebuilding communities, whether it's economic disadvantage or if it's a health crisis like the current one, or if it's a political crisis, we've seen them all, we've endured them all, we're still working through all of them. So, if you look back to, I started my career 25 years ago working at Community Control Health Service and Aboriginal Medical Service in Newcastle and then Redfern. And some of the guiding directives, some of the policy documents that we would look to, that I was exposed to as a young health worker coming through, 1989, the National Aboriginal Health Strategy, and then what followed after that was the Ways Forward report, which set the scene for, I think, mental health and what we're seeing today in our common mental health practices. This idea of wraparound services and community engagement and cultural safety. We were talking about this stuff 25, 30 years ago. And then after that, came the social and emotional wellbeing framework between 2004 and 2009. We're building on that. The Mental Health Commission and its Ways Forward in its Living Well report in 2014 talked about communities as a first point of support for people with mental health. And I think we can use that kind of approach right now for our response to, the recovery. Get online, do a bit of research, check out the 2008 Social Justice Report, the 2011. There's chapters on, healing communities. There's chapters on cultural safety. There's lots and lots of information available at the NACHO website. If you go there, you can see how we've responded to this. And I think, rather than think about, think of it in ways of us and them, think of it collectively, and think about what we can share, and how we can learn from each other. Sometimes this might involve the traditional health disciplines, like in mental health, like psychiatry or psychology, stepping out of their realms. It might involve some of the community sector services, like the big NGOs, who have a lot of power, them stepping out of their realms and looking to develop meaningful relationships with community, and to co-design, to share resources. This is the kind of strategy I think will help all services and all organizations rebuild.
Thanks so much, Ken. There was so much in what you were saying, and I was actually taking lots of notes to go and have a look at some of the social justice reports and some of the things that you were talking about. But we've got a question. Someone's raised their hand, but before I do that, I'll just read out some of the comments we've received so far, which one from Stephanie Adam: love that observation by Professor Ife, especially given the uncertainty of this pandemic, as well as inevitable future crisis. Another one: as a sector, we have long known that community-led recovery and community-based programs deliver the best outcomes. How do we better convince government to invest the time and resources into supporting these types of approaches? We will try to get to that later, I think. We've got, could you please ask Ken this question, which is what you kind of answered, but as he said, First Nations community have had lots of practice. They are the leaders. Great seminar. Thanks, Jane Mears. Jane has also asked, could you pop these resources to Ken? Could you pop these resources, the key important reports, on the website for us? And we can work with Ken to get those links to everybody. I might cross over. We've got a question from the audience now from, I've got to move stuff. This is harder than it looks, guys. Oh, she's put her hand down. Okay, there's a question that we've got here from Michael Lang. And he asks, how can children and young people lead in their schools, homes, and neighbourhoods to build connection and recovery? We might ask Alison.
Sure. I mean, I actually think many children in their innocence are really natural leaders, because in many children are quite intuitive and really pick up the signals about, what people are thinking and feeling and generally not saying. And a lot of recovery issues is around what people either cannot articulate or aren't yet ready to articulate. And so I think, and it's that honesty element that is really, really important. And I think sometimes in recovery, calling out the stuff that's tough or is hurting is really important. And so I think for us, one of the key characteristics about the COVID-19 is, and I think Jim really alluded to this, is the fear. Our old normal has gone. We don't know what the new normal will be, if there will be anything even like that. And calling out that fear is something. But children tend to be quite upfront about that. So I think for young people, youth more so than children, they are naturally optimistic. They're at the beginning of their lives, their careers. They're thinking about what they're going to do with the world. They tend to not be quite so boxed in about this is the way we do things. And so there's real opportunities there, I think, for kids in their schools and indeed in their families to talk about what could happen out of this. What would we like to see at the end of it? And to really brainstorm almost in a natural way how we think that we could move on from this and what the opportunities are. And they're very open with sharing information with each other. And that's another really key characteristic about recovery, is people having a safe space where they can share what they're feeling. They can try to find the words for what they're feeling, and that they know that it will be listened to by someone who just possibly understands, because they're going through it themselves. So I think all of those are real opportunities for us. And this COVID crisis is going to have a long-term effect. And I think it's doubly important that we have children and young people involved in thinking about what the future post-COVID will look like, because it will be their future post-COVID. They are the ones who should step up and take a role, and more importantly, be given an opportunity to take a role in thinking about what the world might look like post-COVID.
Jim, did you want to add something to that question about how children and young people can lead in their schools and neighbourhoods to build connection and recovery?
Look, I agree completely with what Alison said. I think the ability of young people to tell it how it is with a freshness and an honesty and an energy that some of us don't have anymore. On the other hand, I think we always have to be wary when we make statements like that, not to devalue the wisdom of elders in the process. And so I think we have to find ways that everyone can be involved, because one of the problems with the world we live in is it is very youth-oriented. We are presented with images on television and so on all the time that says, you know, if you're over about 25, you're not as relevant as you used to be. And that's also a very dangerous thing to be done. I think we have to find ways that all ages can contribute. And I think Indigenous people know better than the rest of us how to value the wisdom of elders. So I just want to throw that in as well.
And Ken, did you want to add anything in terms of children and young people and how they can lead?
Yeah, I had a beautiful recollection of a NAIDOC ceremony run by a good mate and brother of mine, Jai Pittman, who's identifies as a Western Sydney, lives on the land of Darug Nation, and he was at the Blacktown Showground, and he had a project where there was about 500 school kids from, I don't know, half a dozen or more schools from that area. And they were doing a ceremony, they were dancing on the Blacktown Showground, and there were 500 of them, there were probably about 200 adults. And the leadership that those kids in partaking that exercise, and the communities, their parents, the teachers, the school, and the Blacktown City Council there, the mayor was there, and a few councillors, they were out there dancing, they got painted up, everyone got painted up and smoked, was just amazing, you know, just incredible. And without any words, that's symbolic of the potential future of community reconciliation, you know, coming together and just supporting one another. And I think when you get people out there on the ground with the dirt underneath their feet, you know, with a bit of paint on, a bit of smoke and some yiddicky didgeridoo and some clapsticks and some dancing, everybody's equal. And I think from that point, you know, we can build really strong relationships and communities and sharing and extend the kinship and extend the family and friendship networks. And I think that's, you know, that's one of the riches that First Nations people can bring to this nation as a whole. So I'm looking forward to seeing more of that.
Great. I have another couple of comments. I'll just read them out before we move to our next question. And the first comment is excellent insights, and the key theme coming through about recovery being led by the community at the local level. In essence, the value and importance of investment by government in local level community-based initiatives. But this is exactly where investment has been lagging in Western Sydney. How do we convince government of this value and the need for universal place-based local level community development projects? Ooh, so there's a bit of a comment and a question. So maybe Jim, community development, I mean, you wrote the book,
You would
How do we?
throw me the hard question, wouldn't you, Anita?
Yeah.
It is, but how do we convince government of this value and the need for universal place-based, local level community development projects?
Because let's face it, the governments that we have are so tied into a neoliberalism that says you only think about individuals, and they will think in terms of individual recoveries and so on, that it's very hard to get that community message across. And I think one of the ways we have to try and do it is by actually demonstrating how powerful local communities are and how important they are, and have them doing things that are visible, that forces government to take notice. I think we can see with the Black Lives Matter thing, for example, we're seeing a great outpouring of anger and of commitment to a better world by an awful lot of people. And it's actually forcing governments to recognise that they've got a problem they've got to do something about. And I think we've got to do that with community, because so much of government thinking is based on the individual and the valuing of the individual, and their whole economic systems based on the individual, and so on. Challenging that is very difficult. But I think there are many people who do challenge it. I'm sure most, if not everybody, present today would be challenging that. But also, it's where artists, writers, community cultural development workers, where dancers and singers and the creative industries generally are very good at challenging those things and at asking those questions, and filmmakers and so on. So supporting not just writing yet more submissions to government and yet more funding submissions and yet more things like that, but also finding the more imaginative and publicly in-your-face ways of forcing government to recognise community. And I think once they do that, they'll start funding community. Now, that's a bit of a long-term strategy, but I know it's such a frustration that community workers have all the time, because we know the value of community. We also know that it's something that's been demonstrated again and again around the world, how important community is. But when people don't, have their set of blinkers and don't see that, and don't want to see it, then it's a different matter. And I think also we have to do it in the ways that governments understand. And government, as you know, understands the economy before it understands anything else. Mm-hmm. And so actually showing how local community economies can be really important, can be really strong, can be that actually communities can be about the economy as well. So if the economy can be about community, is then again breaking that set of blinkers that government's got. So those are just a couple of thoughts in response to your impossible question, Anita.
Oh, that was from the audience.
Anita, can I add to that, please?
Yes, of course, Ken.
Just in the spirit of local projects and local resourcing. So you might be aware, in Australia we have about between 55 and 57,000 registered charities. A lot of the local projects depend on the involvement of the not-for-profit sector, not just the government, right? The local government. You know that Western Sydney has a welfare economy of about $2.3 billion. A lot of that is tied into the not-for-profit sector. And so there's about between 55 and 57,000 charities in Australia. Did you know that the top 4 charities get 80% of that funding? And so I would like to see, and in the spirit of leadership, the second question I was asked, maybe an outcome of this forum could be that we hold another forum that is around engaging the CEOs and directors of the not-for-profit sector. And we ask them a few questions, maybe a few difficult questions. What are they doing to foster local community projects? Who are they collaborating with? Can they demonstrate cultural safety? Can they demonstrate that they've adopted the recommendations of the 2011 Social Justice Report around assessing their policies around cultural safety, doing a cultural safety audit? Because that step on itself in its own, like adopting a reconciliation action plan, will lead to some kind of action locally. And I think that could be another place to start.
Absolutely.
Let's think about that.
Anita, can I add something?
Sorry, Alison?
Can I add something as well to that?
Absolutely.
So, being in the government, I obviously need to be careful, and I don't have a how-to manual of how to convince the government to fund things. But I'll just throw in a couple of things. One is the phrase avoided costs to government. And when you are trying to the government speak to people about, you know, where the value is in doing certain things, you know, Jim is quite right. Governments do think about economy, you know, they have to make a choice to spend their money here or there. And so I think one of the problems they have with the sort of community things we would all like to see happening in community development and building strengths in communities is that government can't see the immediate return. And that's because there may not be an immediate return, but there is a return in the avoided costs to the government in the future around having to pick up the pieces when the community just can't cope anymore. And so, you know, thinking about dealing with government along those lines, you know, could be of some assistance. The other thing I'll throw in is that in disaster recovery, which is obviously the area I'm sort of coming from at the moment, it is one of the areas where government very strongly recognises there is a need to invest in community. And so while there's never enough money, there is some money that does go into community preparedness and some of the work around that. And probably, I suspect, can I say, a lot more over the next 4 or 5 years around preparedness work. And that would be something I think for our audience and for your members to just be aware of, is that I think there'll be a much more focus now on working with the community to be much more prepared, and your members will be a key part of that.
Thank you so much for the tips. I definitely think there's a further conversation to be had about this one. So thank you to the audience as well for their question. I now have an audience member who's raised her hand. So Bushra Al-Obeidi, we will enable your voice, and please feel free to ask your question.
So are you hearing me now?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, I will introduce myself. I am Bushra Al-Obeidi. I'm a retired family doctor. Working in a non-profit organization in the name of Iraqi Australian University Graduate Forum, which was created in 2008, and we're doing volunteer work. All of us are professionals, but doing volunteer work to help the Iraqi community, the new arrivals and the refugees, to settle and to we are representing all the Iraqi ethnicities, the different Christian, Mandaean, Muslims, and we're representing them all. So we are a big organization. So my concern is that my real concern after the COVID situation is the unemployment, which is the most important matter. I think anybody who want to settle and who want to feel safe and secure is when he is working. So we have many people lost their jobs before COVID and during the COVID. So I don't know what's the plan of the government to retain these people to the industry to work, and how can we seek that help? I mean, we had many sessions about what's the situation before and after, but I think the most important thing is to engage people in employment. Thank you very much.
Do our panelists have any comments or anything to say in relation to employment and some of the issues that were raised by Bushra? I could go.
Anita, just a quick point. So unemployment has been a massive issue in our community, in First Nations communities and communities where there's been disadvantage. And we know that unemployment leads to, increases in criminal or antisocial behaviour. And in our communities where there's, where there's unemployment, you often find a high incidence of mental health and substance abuse. So I think, the question is very, very important because, and I think, that area needs a lot of resources. It needs a lot of focus because we might end up getting, sort of pockets, like almost kind of ghetto pockets of society with these disadvantaged groups that become the next postcodes for people going into the criminal justice system. And then we've got another, a bigger issue. So I think that particular issue, from my experience with our First Nations communities and unemployment mixed with mental health, it's a very serious matter.
Absolutely. Alison, Jim, did you want to add anything?
I just want to add very quickly, it's going to be a long-term problem. We are living in an economy where jobs are getting abolished as quickly as we look. Woolworths yesterday or today or whatever it was. We are living in a society where artificial intelligence is going to take over a lot more jobs of people. Automation is going to take over more jobs. And our traditional understanding of what a job is and our traditional understanding of how we get the money that we need for our daily security is going to be a long-term question and thrown into insecurity. It's one of the areas where I don't think we're going to bounce back. I think unemployment is going to remain a serious issue. And I think we have to try and be a bit more imaginative in communities about thinking about what is employment, what is unemployment, what does it mean? Are there other ways that people can lead fulfilled lives? We're so used to not asking that question and to assuming that the labour market is what meets all our needs. But again, it's one of those areas where we're facing a serious crisis about the future of work, what work is. So again, like all these things, this has to be something that communities think about, start talking about, start saying, what do jobs mean in our community? Can we think about our community differently in terms of how we support people? I don't have ready answers to this, but I think we've got to be asking the questions.
Thanks, Jim. Alison, did you want to add anything before we go into our final question?
No, I don't think so. Not really, except to agree with what both Jim and Ken have said. And I think it's one of the fears, I think, for all of us going forward, is that, yes, the whole concept of work as we have known it and the concept of job security as we've known it, I think is going to be fundamentally changed. The foundation has just moved underneath us.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll have to unfortunately move us into our last question. So this one's for all three of you. So what is one thing or one piece of advice you would like to share with community organisations regarding resilience and recovery? So I might go to Alison.
I think what I'd like to share is that your people better than anybody does. And that's the key to you being able to work with people around resilience and recovery. Every recovery journey in any community is all about each of us one at a time, in our own time, according to what we need and how we need it. And so I think it's why organisations like yours are so vital in recovery, because some households, families, individuals can do that kind of thing on their own. Many can't. Most can't and don't. Even if they don't acknowledge the support they get from others around them, it's there and they get it. So organisations like yours really are the key to working with people who need some support to being able to, in a crisis, build their own recovery, articulate what it is that's going on in their lives, identify how to reach out and ask for assistance, advocate on their behalf about where there's gaps and they're not getting help that they need, And then your organisations are also so well placed to make sure that they can work with their individual clients around thinking about their own circumstances, you know, doing their own personal risk assessment. What are the risks in my life? What are the really important things? Is it physical things because I have special needs? Is it emotional things? Is it some other kind of need that I have in my life? Working with people around that individual, thinking about their lives. What would be the worst thing that could go wrong for me? What can I do or will I do if that happens? So those, you know, preparedness for adversity and recovery from adversity starts with every individual. And we do have some resources, which I will share with you, Anita, to share with the group, around working with NGOs to be prepared for resilience and disaster recovery. But your organisations are absolutely vital parts of the cog in making sure that groups in our community who do need assistance to do this thinking and walk through it are able to do that.
Thanks, Alison. Jim?
Yeah, I think I'd agree with absolutely everything Alison said. But I think what I'd want to say is, if we're talking about rebuilding, it sounds like something's been demolished. And the community hasn't been demolished, it's still there. And I think back to that old community development principle of working with the community's strengths, of assets-based, of looking at what the strengths are, what's in the community to build on it, and not falling into the trap of being deficit-based in the way we talk about and use the term rebuilding. So I guess I'd want to emphasise on going back and looking at what are the strengths of the community. What does the community do well? What's it got to build on as being the where we should start. So yeah, that's all I want to add, I think.
Thanks, Jim. And Ken, did you want to add to what's one piece of advice you'd like to share, or one thing you'd like to share in regards to resilience and recovery?
I suppose it follows on from what Jim said about the new norm of COVID-19 is going to take a long time, and we won't know what it is for some time. I just think that I think people need to prepare themselves for living with less than what they may have lived with, even in disadvantaged communities, or sort of disadvantaged to middle class communities. Prepare themselves for maybe living with less, because we haven't seen a recession in 25 years. There's a generation of people who are kind of used to a very sort of consumer type culture and spending and credit and personal debt and just having things, material things. I think we know that throughout history that communities have learned to live with very little during times of war or times of depression or times of natural disaster. So perhaps prepare themselves for an adjustment in their values around material or around excess, things that people think that they need, that might also tie into their identity and sense of self. I guess just finally, one of the skills in our leadership development, in our coaching model, draws from the acceptance commitment therapy, and it's what we call a pro-social question, and it asks, what do you value and what are you prepared to do about it? So it calls us to have a good hard look at what we value in life, and to make some hard decisions about what we're prepared to do to live our lives according to our values. And I hope that in defining our values going forward, that we can look at leaders from today's forum and in community, and we can get back to values around compassionate action and social concern and kinship and strengths-based, that multiculturalism, that sense of oneness, because that's eventually what will that's what it comes down to in the end. And I think that's what will pull us out of it in the end as well.
Great, thanks, Ken. So I need to move us along because we're going to be kicked off in 2 minutes. I just want to thank all of you. This was so inspiring for me personally, and I'm sure it was to the audience members as well. So I would like to thank you, Ken, Jim, and Alison, for joining us. You all were so open and willing to share your insights, and I think it was wonderful. So I'd like to thank you. So thanks, Ken.
Thanks.
Thanks, Anita. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
And to all the participants, the listeners out there as well.
So I just wanted to just sum up and say something about the session. So I'm really inspired by the session. It's clear what came through today was grassroots community, resilience, rebuilding. The community's there, the issues are there. We know what to do. The community knows what to do. And we just need to work together to make that happen. I'm sure there'll be some more forums to discuss this, and I know that everyone in the audience is really well placed and knows their community well, and will work with them in rebuilding. Probably for me, the next step is looking at how do we do that collaboratively, and let's do that together and share our resources. I know that we didn't get to everybody's questions, so I apologize for that. We will endeavour to respond to your question outside of this session. So rest assured, it will, you know, your question was important. We just didn't get to it, but we will. It's a good time to remind you that Western Sydney Community Forum has a range of services to support community organisations during COVID-19. If you do want some support or have any further questions, please feel free to contact us. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us. Stay well and goodbye.